Well, in this video, I want to talk about a book that I just finished reading. The book is Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs. And as I've been reading this, basically every day that I read it would cause me on several occasions an urge to do a video. It's very, very thought-provoking. Uh, there's a lot of stuff in it that I already knew or already heard, uh, but Higgs's exposition is amazing. There's a lot of information I didn't know. Uh, Higgs is as even-handed and fair as you can be. He is a Misesian, he's an Austrian economist, but he is able to, walk in the world of macroeconomics and statisticians and econometrics and derive or use empiricism very well. And although he is, I think, a senior fellow at the Mises Institute, he's actually a senior fellow at something called the Independent Institute, which is a fairly decent organization from what I can tell. And I have listened to his interviews. He's been interviewed by Scott Horton on anti-war radio many times. He's given lectures at the Mises Institute many, many, many times. He's been interviewed recently by the likes of Tom Woods, and I probably easily listened to 15, 20 hours of him talking. This is the third of his books that I've read. The other one is Depression, War, and Cold War, which I highly, highly, highly recommend. The other one is called The Transformation of the American Economy, 1865 to 1914. It's a thin little book, but it is very, very interesting. Now, I don't want to go through a run-through of the book and its contents so much as some of the things that got me thinking of. Basically, the book made me very sad. And as I was getting towards the end, it made me much. I don't know if this happens to the rest of you all, but sometimes when I read, I really start to think a lot about what I've just read, and sometimes it interferes with my current reading. But anyway, basically that we can be thankful that we're not omniscient, because then we can at least hope. Because the prognosis, as far as the available data for us to look at, is not very good. And I don't mean in the sense of current inflation or a likelihood of a war with Iran. I mean in the sense that the ideology of the society throughout the world, really, but in the United States, is the context through most of my considerations and his in the book, that there's a de facto uncritical acceptance of not only big government, and I mean big government in the sense that it has power over all of us and our property, arbitrary plenary power that it just does not choose to exercise all the time, and that if and when crises happen, that it will abrogate more power. And for those of us who know anything, this is something to be dreaded, to feared. And it's made especially worse by the fact that the people who make it possible, who believe in it, don't believe in it in any critical sense. They have not analyzed it, they just accept it to their detriment. And it was kind of funny in a sardonic way, because his last paragraph of the book, he basically says exactly the same things that I had just been thinking reading his concluding chapter, which was, things look very, very bad, but we have to acknowledge that we don't know, or he says he uses that pronoun, he says I have to acknowledge that I don't know everything, and then perhaps there is some hope. And thank God for that, because if there wasn't, we would all go crazy. Now, this book was written in the mid-'80s. Oh, and an aside here, to give you some idea of how worthy it is, Murray Rothbard required all of his students to read it. It is that good, and I think it stands on par with any of Rothbard's works. It's an amazing synthesis of history and economics and philosophy, and I can't say enough about how good these books are. And I know I've recommended them before. I know I have subscribers who are reading them. If I have other subscribers who are not, please do. I'm sure you can get it for free, but you can find copies also. on the internet. But the premise of the book is that when a crisis happens, the government gets bigger, and then typically it will get smaller again, but it will not get as small as it was before, and it will continue to grow. And he basically documents this. And one thing I learned from this that I didn't know before is that there really was a very short, very short time span where, in principle, the floodgates opened. Everyone here should be aware of the progressive era. It is one of the most misconceived eras in American history, misunderstood. Basically, the general narrative is that there are all these market failures in society, cartels, monopolies, inferior products, poisonous, Upton Sinclairian mythic food, and that the government, either through popular agitation or by its own beneficence, intervened to correct these flagrant problems with free market capitalism, and society's that much the better for it. Now, this is, of course, all false. None of the monopolies claims are real. None of the cartel claims are real. The most obvious flaw, though, is that the people who propagated and encouraged and caused the politics and the legislation of the progressive era were the mega rich. It was the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, especially, and the Bernard Baruchs. It was not the Upton St. Clairs and the recently immigrated socialists from Europe. Those people were just dupes and pawns who were taken advantage of. Anyway, that's not my point. This first episode is in the 1890s in the presidency of Grover Cleveland, because there were a number of crises during Grover Cleveland's presidency, and basically Grover Cleveland, and not just himself, but also many members of the Supreme Court and the Congress and everything, basically responded that these crises are not the role of government. Government does not have the right to intervene, say, in a railroad strike. Government does not have the right to fail to honor its obligations and pay out gold. At the time, there was a lot of agitation. This is epitomized with likes of William Jennings Bryan's to get off the gold standard and to embrace some kind of bimetallicism, the free silver movement. These were actually just inflationist schemes. We want inflation. That would be good. And Cleveland rejected all these. And it wasn't just him. It was many. And there was just an amazing belief in the free market and in private property rights, and the idea that if you own something, it is yours, and the government can't tell you how you contract with your employees. It can't just take your goods. It can't abrogate their use. And in the 1890s, this was still true, and this was the majority view of most people, and this was reflected from what we can tell in the populace at large. And then, right before World War I, it wasn't so much the Fed, but there was another court case with very similarly a dispute between the railroads, and the government interceded and basically nationalized the railroads, and the Supreme Court in that case said it was acceptable. And so there was the two decisions were completely opposite, and that marked, in principle, the abolition of private property. Yes, we still get to keep the things that we have, but we don't get to direct their use to our, in whatever way we see fit. The government reserves the right to do that. And of course, during World War I, which happened within a few months of this court case, actually, it would be wrong to characterize the court case as having caused this. The court case is emblematic of a shift in ideology, at the very least, within the political elites who make up members of the court and Congress who passed the law, and the president, obviously, Woodrow Wilson in that case. And Higgs makes the point to say, well, there are still many people who were still free market advocates, but they had to swallow big government for World War I. And he says there was still a constituency, there were still a lot of congressmen. He said especially in the Midwest, there were a lot of people who were basically Jeffersonian Democrats who believed in freedom, who rejected the idea that the government could intercede in labor contracts, labor disputes, setting prices, all that sort of thing. But then the principle that was endorsed under Wilson was exercised under Roosevelt, and actually under Hoover too, although to a lesser degree, in a major way during the Depression and World War II. And when that finished, the libertarian element in American society had basically disintegrated. And it's really, really sad. Were there still people? Yes. But they were fractured. They were spread everywhere. There wasn't a region where there were many of them. There weren't any Congress people to represent them. They were completely, totally politically disenfranchised, discredited in the intelligentsia and in academia. And I'm not talking here just about like the Albert J. Knox and the Garrett Garretts and the few classical liberals, the Henry Hazlitt's, who was exceptional in the sense that he actually continued to have a successful career for a long time in this. I think because he believed in the Cold War, at least in part. But I'm talking just about the populace, the people who would have believed they have a right to their property, and the idea that the government tells them what crops to grow, how many hours they can work, how much they can, if they can contract to pay for gold or silver or not. Those type of people, I don't know, did they all die, or did they change their minds? Did they just resign to the new order? I guess it must be the combination of all of the above, and probably some others I haven't listed. And it's very, very disheartening. And if we contrast the character of America today to that which existed in 1890, which of course was not perfect, there is no comparison at all. The degree to which we accept government rulership over us, the degree that we accept their direction, where we still have libertarian reminiscences, we can speak and we can talk. But in terms of our property, very few people consider taxation to be an imposition on them, or conscription, which we don't actively conscript anymore, although that's a recent phenomenon. They reserve the right to do it, and nobody argues that conscription is wrong in and of itself. They might just say it's not a good idea at this point. Conscription, I think, is one of the biggest ones in the 20th century. It's kind of been downplayed since they stopped doing it actively, but they still cause everyone to register for the draft on pain of imprisonment. And they reserve the right at any moment to do basically anything, to take, to nationalize, to direct the use, all this stuff with Obamacare and subsequent regulations and NDAA and all that stuff. What's the difference between saying you can be enslaved to fight a war you're against and you can be killed for a crime you haven't been charged with? There isn't a huge difference. There's no difference, really. Sending a soldier to war means the possibility of his death. Oh, an interesting fact about the war is after the United States declared war in World War I, they didn't have a draft. And for the first 10 days that the war was declared, on average about 435 people volunteered to join the Army. 435 people for the entire country per day after the war was declared. That tells you how eager people were to get involved in the war. Not very. So they had to pass a draft to fight the war, for the war that was in our own interests, but that nobody wanted to fight. Certainly the people who passed the law didn't go out and fight in the trenches. No. That's just an interesting fact that I learned from the book that I would not have otherwise known. One of many that enhanced my understanding of the world. And so it's very sad. It's very disheartening. You look around, and people today, they don't have a clue. It's one thing for someone to not care at all, to be totally ambivalent, but then to go, and I think part of the reason I'm doing this is because of this recent Super Tuesday. Not that Ron Paul, who again is extremely significant because he is the first constituent, the first politician representing the constituent of the remnant of the people who actually believe in liberty, like in decades. And a better one than any of his predecessors to boot, I would argue. Anyway, if you look at all the people who vote for somebody like Mitt Romney, Santorum, or Gingrich, how do people vote for them? How do people look at them or Obama and actively cast a ballot for that? You have to be a moron. You have to have so many contradictory beliefs that it boggles the mind, and a complete apathy and a complete acceptance of government power and brutality, because everything that they want is that. Even the soft ones, who, even if they didn't want a war, they still think the government has the right to steal and take whatever it wants from us, to tell us what to do, and to actually actively cast a vote for that, especially when there's an alternative. An actual, I can understand being pragmatic and saying, yeah, obviously they're both evil, but the lesser of two evils. I can, on pragmatic grounds, understand that. I'm not necessarily going to do it myself, but I can understand that. But when you have the alternative, and this is not a video about how much I like Ron Paul or whatever. It's again evidencing the rot in society. The fact that so many individuals are so lost, and that they could actually go and vote for it. And these people are nobodies. No one's going to remember these politicians and after they're gone, which hopefully will be soon. But it made me very sad. But also, Higgs says he doesn't see any reason to hope. He just says, because I don't have perfect knowledge, I guess it's plausible that there's some good news somewhere. But I think he sells himself short, because one thing he talks about a lot is ideology. He says ideology, there isn't a coherent theory of ideology. We don't understand its role and how it shapes society, other than it seems to be very significant. And at the beginning of the book, he talks about lots of people have studied the growth of government, and he gives the different theories as to why, and he presents his own, which apparently he did not come up with the idea that government grows during crisis. Other people have posited that as well, but he has offered a great deal of evidence in support of it, but he doesn't support it to the exclusion of all others. He just thinks it's better than the other ones by and large. But at the end, he said he admits one problem of it, the one that he did not admit when he was introducing it originally, and that is, during the 19th century, there were many crises. There were many crises in the United States. In fact, one's many orders of magnitude worse than anything in the 20th century. The Civil War comes to mind here. It would not be hyperbole to say the Civil War was at least 100 times more threatening than World War II was. The Japanese threat to the United States was basically not any more than Pancho Villa's. I mean, yeah, they'd kill more people, but the idea that they were going to take over the country, or that the Germans were, is delusionally absurd. The Civil War is different. That's a major, major rebellion, but we could choose other. There was, of course, the Mexican-American War. There are any number of Native American conflicts that were much more threatening and dangerous to the American polity than anything in the 20th century. There were, of course, economic ups and downs. There was the creation, abolition of 2 central banks. And yet, when these crises happened afterwards, there's no growth of government. It's amazing that the Civil War, there really was a return to normalcy. There was, oh, we're back, and there was Reconstruction, and Reconstruction was undone, and they actually returned to a gold standard. And he just says, well, it just didn't happen in the 18th century. And he doesn't offer why, and I think it's obvious why. And the reason it's obvious is the one he actually talked about earlier. It's why Grover Cleveland did not end the gold standard or intercede into labor disputes that were none of their damn business. And it's ideology. And the hopeful thing, the actual reason to have hope, as opposed to just, we don't know everything, so let's assume there's a possibility, is that obviously ideology can change, because it did. In this country, there was a much better ideology when it comes to this, when it comes to the role of the state within society. Now you could say, well, there were other ideologies that were bad about race, about sexual identity, about that sort of thing, about religion if you're big into atheism. But there was a very good understanding that government is dangerous, that it has a limited role at best, and then to go beyond that is not only not a good idea, but is evil. That was the dominant view of government. Even the people who wanted a more aggressive government, even somebody like Hamilton, or the big, more corrupt politicians in the 1880s or whatever, they still would have. They said, well, the government should do a little bit more, but beyond that, no. Obviously, this is opposed to the government has the ability to do anything. It's just a question of what it wants to do that is the pertinent debating point. You know, there's a famous tax collector in Louis XIV, which is the point of taxation is to get is like taking the feathers off a goose. You want to get the maximum feathers with the least amount of hissing. You know, so they do worry about the hissing, but they don't care about taking the feathers. So there was an enormous ideological shift. Why? We don't know. Apparently it happened. I mean, I can't say exactly why. I can point to some indicators of what happened. One is it didn't happen to everybody. It happened to certain groups of people, especially the Eastern establishment. And there's a very clear European linkage there. There's a very clear deference to and emulation of Europe, especially Britain, that is actually explicit in World War I. Before we entered the war even, a lot of these people, we'll name some of them, that I could name many more, the real movers and shakers, they lamented the fact that people didn't want big government because that's not what the British had and they wanted that, or the Germans. This book is amazing because they talk about some of the debates about, say, conscription or whatever in World War I. And people said, why would we do this? This is Prussianizing America, which is exactly correct. And why would we want to do that? This is before World War II, but you don't want to be like Prussia. But these Eastern establishment were converted. I would say at least partially because of self-interest, because contrary to what all the moronic Cornel Wests of the world think, the progressive era in government intervention in the economy benefits an elite class far more than anybody else, in absolute and in relative terms. And so these powerful people stood to benefit from it. It also might have been a sincere belief. I think a lot of them were eugenicists and believed that they were superior to everybody else. Absolute conceit. And that naturally their domination over the rest of us is going to take the form not of like being a good capitalist, but of government control. That would be kind of the more Alex Jonesian view of history, and I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's not complete. And then, of course, the effect on the intelligentsia and the propaganda. There was very explicit propaganda to get Americans to accept things like World War I and the draft, and again in World War II. And this had an effect. The ideology can change. And I think the 20th century has revealed the costs of government, that it really is a case of cognitive dissonance now that people are so for it. And those people, some of them, I think most of those people have at least the potential, if the circumstances are right, to change their mind. Now, that doesn't mean that if they watch my YouTube video or your YouTube video or they read one book that they'll do that. No. It may be more difficult. It might take something much more visceral. They're going to have to get tased by a cop. They're going to have their face smashed in. They're going to have to know somebody who is aggrieved in some horrible way. It's going to take something like that. And not fortunately, but predictably, as the depredations of the government become bigger, this is Higgs in the 80s, it's much worse now. As we can assume is going to happen, more and more people will be directly affected and more people will indirectly witness. Well, we're all going to feel it through inflation and taxation. And more people will search for alternatives. And the big kind of development in terms of the battle of ideas since Higgs wrote this book is, of course, the internet, which I think sometimes is revolutionary impact has been overstated, at least in certain. It's definitely revolutionary, but not necessarily revolutionary in every single aspect of human existence. But the so-called gatekeepers, the controllers of ideology, the big institutions, it used to be the newspapers and then radio and television, but then the universities, their power to disseminate ideas has been challenged irrevocably. I mean, that cat's out of the bag now, I'm sorry to say. Or not sorry to say, I'm happy to say. And there is reason to hope. You know, I was just the other day listening to Mark Levin, who I don't listen to him. It was because he was talking about Murray Rothbard. And at one point he read an obituary for Rothbard written by William F. Buckley. And William F. Buckley said that, you know, Rothbard was just a contrarian who had a tiny, tiny group of followers cloistered around him in his apartment. And what was so biting about that statement is that it was true, that it was accurate. How many Rothbardians were there in the 80s, or in the 90s when he died? Very, very few. How many are there now? I don't know. It's more than a few cloistered in an apartment, though. It's a lot more than that. I have more subscribers that are Rothbardians than existed probably 15, 20 years ago. Maybe that's a little bit of exaggeration. 30, 40 years ago, for sure. I don't have that many subscribers, by the way. And it would be wrong to say we only can speak of Rothbardians here. That's just the most pure radical element I can think of. The best, if someone's a Rothbardian, then they are definitely a libertarian who understands the role of government. There's others. There is kind of the paleo-conservatives. They're out there. I don't know how much they've grown in number, but they're out there. So I don't know what's going to happen. But I know that it can change. Part of the reason I do this is because I want it to change. I'm doing the only thing I know how. I realize that I'm mostly preaching to the choir here, but my hope is that maybe I can tell them something that they haven't already heard, and that they can hence have a better argument when they debate other people. And also that you convert more people. The term convert has religious connotations that I don't like so much, but I think it's a fairly apt description of the process that we'd like to see happening. And it is happening. And of course, to return to who I already mentioned, this whole Ron Paul thing is showing that. And it's an interplay. There's a feedback loop between Ron Paul being both the cause and just the lightning rod that's attracting. Originally, I think Ron Paul was the go-to guy. If you were a libertarian 10 years ago, if you really honestly knew that the government was wrong, that its role in society was an abomination and a disaster in progress and waiting to happen, then he was the only guy you could really look at. And so he had a lot of support because of that. Now, he has since grown that support enormously. Enormously. And I don't think he's going to get the nomination. And I don't think the shift in ideology requires him to win the presidency. And the shift in ideology is the most important thing. Far, far more important than any one person holding office, or even any number of office holders, even the entire government. He says in the book, had FDR come to be president in 1880 or 1890 and tried to do what he did, he could not have done it. No matter how silver-tongued, and indeed he was very silver-tongued, no matter how popular he may have been at his election, he could not have done it. No matter the crisis, even a civil war, he could not have done it. But later, something much less, And I know it sounds weird to talk about World War II, but we could say the same about the Depression. Something much less, he was able to do that because this changed. Among not everybody, but too many people. Again, I don't know why. I've made so many videos on I call them the libertarian spark in American society. And it's because I want to know what it is, so that I can turn that spark into a fucking flame. That's what I want to do. And it's one of those things where wouldn't it be easier just because of how much effect am I having, or is anybody having, or are we generally having? It doesn't seem to be a lot. It's very hard to quantify this. I mean, really, it's impossible to get a good... We can say how many people voted for Ron Paul. What does that really mean? How many people really wanted to? How many people just voted for him for accident? We don't know. We can't quantify or qualify our success here, really. Polls, that doesn't really show anything. But the way I look at it is I don't have a choice here. The government is, to me, the most dangerous thing in this society. I mean, we might argue about like a meteor striking or something like that, or a plague. Although I don't particularly think either of those are that likely. But among the institutions of man, there's not private criminals? No. And it's not just that they might genocide me, although that's always the possibility. How likely is, debatable, but it's always a possibility. But it's the fact that they rob my wealth, my hard-earned money, and they tie my hands. And like I said in my peak oil video, they can stratify the direction of our development to the point where we will literally go off a cliff. Or if we don't go off a cliff, at least get in a huge fender bender. And when the government, a societal fender bender could mean a declining, an increased death rate or something. Or an increased incarceration rate. And that's not a hypothetical, that's what we have. So, I don't see I have any other option but to fight this fight. Also, it can be fun to do. So, it's kind of like owning guns. I don't think you have any option, really. If you want to defend yourself, if you're not an absolute pacifist, you don't have an option. You need to own guns. And they can be fun. But it is a sobering state of affairs right now. How much we've lost, and how much we have to get back. And the thing is none of us really know how. I just read an article by Patrick Friedman that he wrote back in 2009 about how all these libertarians have been trying to convince people for years, and that was wrong because that's never going to convince anybody. We just need real world examples, hence the seasteading, and now he's doing free cities. Really, he's doing the same thing because his whole point was this way people will be able to look at a counterexample and say, look. But those counterexamples already exist for those who want to look. I was just watching a Bitbutter video, and he said, why is there this empirical consensus that prosperity in societies are inversely correlated or related to the size of their governments? So the smaller their governments, the freer their economies, the more wealthy they are. That's pretty true. That's very true, actually. And I mean, the minarchists out there have this magical number, beyond which that doesn't apply anymore, because that's wrong. But I think Friedman's getting it wrong because we already have examples you can look at. We can look at this country in the past. The claims that the government, that things were worse back then are pretty dubious. They're ignoring that, things were starting off in the past, there was less technology, and then they're fear-mongering about the monopolies and all that, all this stuff that's completely mythological. They might as well have said the economy was bad because unicorns and balrogs were suppressing it until the government vanquished them. And to give people, I mean, Hong Kong exists today, and that doesn't convince how many people have been convinced because of Hong Kong? North Korea exists today. Has anyone been convinced by that? Or Russia? No. I mean, I was, because I looked into it, but most people aren't willing to do that. And so giving them a counterexample on the ocean or in Costa Rica or Honduras, I'm all for them trying, and it can't hurt, but I don't see how that's the magic bullet. And that's the thing, is I don't see a magic bullet here. I see a very emergent, bottoms up process of ideological shift that has been influenced in the past somehow. And I mean, is that what it takes? Do we have to control all the universities and control all the propaganda? Is that what we need to do? I hope that's not it. I hope that's not it. You know, that's an imperfect instrument in itself, because even doing that, ideology is such that you can't just make it do whatever it is that you want. Even the most tyrannical governments, aren't able to just say, okay, German people, this is exactly how you need to be, and then they did it. Because even they would make concessions. Even the Nazis and the Soviets would make concessions when they thought that they had to for ideological reasons. Roosevelt didn't get everything he possibly could want. Small. It's a pretty small, what's the word? I don't remember. I think I'm going crazy. Uh, it, it's not much compensation to say he didn't get everything he wanted, but he didn't, because there was ideological inertia. There was, he couldn't go that far, as especially evident in his so-called court packing scheme. Which, of course, well, this is another story, but I don't know. This is all I can think to do, so this is what I do. And then I tell people to read Robert Higgs, and maybe they'll tell other people to read Robert Higgs. And, if we each can convince a couple dozen people, then we'll have more, and whatever. I mean, I don't know what else to do, so that's it. Let's hope that it happens, and act to make that hope happen.